February 2nd, 2026, and I'm your host, Jacob Fulmer. And in tonight's top news story, a partial government shutdown is already underway. Is there going to be an end in sight? And then we also have a couple of other news stories talking about a trade deal that Trump has made with India, a $100 million investment in the Great American Recovery, and then the world's biggest arch for the 250th anniversary. We also have a couple of other stories as well. But before we get into that, we do have a weekly question that we would like to ask you, and you can answer this in the comments below or with GWP International at AT&T.com. That's our email that you can email us the answer to this question. It's not necessarily a right or wrong, it's just really what your opinion is, and it has to do with the state of Missouri. Something that we've covered in a previous newscast is that the state of Missouri is considering raising the speed limit for rural interstates from 70 to 75 miles per hour. Our question to you is, do you feel like that the state of Missouri should do that? Why or why not? That is our question of the week, and you can email your response at GWP international at AT&T.com. You can also ring in through 417-448-0819. If nobody answers, you can leave a voicemail. There is a possibility that your answer that you email or phone in could actually make it in a future newscast. So just keep that in mind when you are answering that it's something that it's an answer that you would want other people to hear, if you know what I mean by that. So we'll go ahead. We'll go into our top news story for today, which is the partial government shutdown that is going to or has already occurred. But the question now is, when is it going to come to an end? Of course, the House was back in Washington today to consider revising this funding package that could end the partial government shutdown that began on January 30th, or at least that night of January 30th, and that was this past Friday. And so this would fund Departments of Defense, State Treasury, and others, as well as a 2-week extension on the funding for the Department of Homeland Security. So there is a possibility, according to House Speaker Mike Johnson, that there is a possibility that this bill that was voted on in the Senate could make its way to the House and could be voted on as early as tomorrow, Tuesday, February 3rd. Then the bill would go to the president. President Trump would have to sign an approval of Congress's legislative bill in order to extend the government funding within the budget, and that would allow for the partial government shutdown to come to a conclusion. Again, this is not a full shutdown as what we saw back in the fall. There was an extension in the fall that allowed for some of the departments in order to continue spending all the way through next fall, but there was a few of those different departments that we mentioned, the defense, the state treasury, as well as a few others that the extension went only until January 30th. And so now that that has expired, that means that technically the U.S. government is currently in a partial shutdown. So just keep that in mind, that it only affects certain areas of the government's budget, but certain areas, in fact, the majority of the government would be included within that partial shutdown that is occurring. Again, as early as Tuesday is when that legislative bill could be set into motion. It could be voted on in the House, which would end that shutdown. We'll continue to provide any updates here on GWP as we get them. Of course, this week there will not be a GWP weekly recap, as instead we will have one of our new episodes on the Great World Podcasting. We won't have a weekly recap, but you can stay tuned for updates on that next week in our weekly news, as well as we may do a couple of live streams, maybe a couple of short videos if there's any changes when it comes to that government shutdown, so you'll have to stay tuned for that. So that leads us into our next story involving the president, as well as Trump made an announcement that a trade deal has been made with India. The agreement was pretty short, but President Trump said that India has now promised to stop buying Russian oil and would start to turn their attention more towards U.S. products. This is going to cause a reduction on tariffs. This happened earlier today, And so what we know is that Mr. Trump put in a social media post talking about that the US tariff would be falling to 18%. We don't know a whole lot of details about this at this point in time. That's pretty much all that we have on that news story. But just like we said with the government shutdown, we will continue to update you on any new information that we get regarding the subject. So that brings us into our next top news story, which involves Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. today making an announcement for a plan to strengthen prevention, expand treatment, and carry out the executive order that President Trump signed during last week, talking about the Great American Recovery. That was the executive order that Trump signed. And so this plan includes a $100 million investment to solve longstanding homelessness issues, to fight opioid addiction, and improve public safety. This would be expanding treatment when it comes to the recovery process as well as self-sufficiency. So that is what the goal is. This was quote from Secretary Kennedy: addiction begins in isolation and ends in reconnection, which is one of the main goals when it comes to this investment plan called the Great American Recovery. So um, we also know at this point in time that it is mainly regarding, again, substance abuse. That is one of the main concerns that Secretary Kennedy is trying to fix with this particular issue. Of course, when it comes to the repeated use of alcohol and or other drugs, it turns out that among people aged 12 and older, the people using these went from 7.4% in 2019 to 16.8% in 2024. We also know that nearly 8 in 10 people with a substance use disorder in 2024 did not receive any treatment. So that is what Secretary Kennedy's goal is with this. Again, $100 million is being investigated into this executive order called the Great American Recovery. So now we'll go ahead and we'll go into our next big story, which also involves an announcement from the president, President Trump, saying over the weekend that he would like to build a 250-foot arch. This has to do with the 250th anniversary of the country. The idea is that it would be the tallest arch in the world. That's what his goal is. And he said, quote, "I'd like it to be the biggest one of all." That was what Trump told reporters on Air Force One Sunday night. He said, "We're the biggest, most powerful nation." So planes can't cross over the National Mall in Washington due to these flight restrictions, and the same is true across the Pentagon. So current flight paths lead them to follow the Potomac River, and that is where the proposed arch would be built. The biggest concern at this point in time is that this arch could become a problem if it becomes too high. That being said, Trump's goal in this is not necessarily to block those flight paths coming in across the Pentagon, but to be a statement going into the Pentagon over the Potomac River. At this point in time, construction plans have not been made, but we'll have to see in the weeks to come whether or not this actually does happen. Again, if the plans were to be laid out, they would most likely be laid out this year because we are in that 250th anniversary here of the nation. And so that's the idea behind it being 250 feet. But again, when you have an object this large that would be going over the water, you have to start to put into question, will this become a problem when it comes to flights? Will it be high enough to where they will be able to fly underneath it? Or is the plan where they're going to be going over it? So again, that and a lot of other details still need to be sorted out with this. This is just some of the latest information that we have coming from this weekend from the president. Again, at this point in time, it's just an idea that the president has. It's not necessarily being drawn out. This isn't like an official plan that's been approved or anything. It's just an idea that the president has. But he sounded very serious about doing this. It didn't just seem like a passing thought. And so this is certainly something that we could start to see, at least the plans. I don't think we would see the construction of it this year, but I think we could start to see some of the initial planning. That could certainly start to happen in the weeks to come. So again, if we have any new information on that, we'll make sure to update you on that. And then the last thing, we were talking about planes going high in the air. Well, now we're going to talk about Artemis 2 going much higher all the way to the moon. Today, Artemis 2 had its wet dress rehearsal, excuse me. And so the idea with that is just to make sure that everything is ready to go for when the launch is expected to happen. At this point in time, the launch window is going to be anywhere between Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, into going into next week. So it could happen as soon as this weekend. Again, this coming Sunday is when we're expecting that to happen, considering that everything went off the way that it was supposed to. This would be a 10-day mission, is what the idea is, and the mission type is a crewed lunar flyby. So that's what um, the mission's goal is. There's going to be 4 members who would be flying or who would be in this mission. That's Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christian Knock, and Jeremy Hansen. So those are the crew members. So it's a 4 crew spacecraft that is going to be going to the moon, or at least flying around the moon. And again, expect it to take off as soon as this Sunday. We will update you with any new details as they come out. Now we'll go ahead and we'll move into weather. So now we go into weather. And if we look back 10 years ago on Groundhog's Day, we actually had a blizzard across Missouri. It was one of the biggest snowfalls that the state has ever seen. And here's some of those numbers from NOAA here showing you that Warrensburg, Missouri picked up nearly 2 feet of snow at 23 inches. That surpassed the previous daily record of snow at 20 inches. We also had Sedalia, 21, Boonville, 19. The Kansas City area also picked up about a foot of snow. So, of course, we didn't have nearly this amount of snow, not this past weekend, but the weekend before that. But we did have a decent snowstorm, but certainly nothing in comparison to what will forever be known as the Groundhog Day blizzard. It actually ended up being $1 billion disaster, and there was over 30 people that died from this winter storm across the nation. So it certainly was a destructive winter storm that we saw here. And you'll notice here some of those snowfall totals. It started on February 1st and continued through February 2nd. So of course we had some of those higher totals just to the southeast of Kansas City. Something else that was interesting is Interstate 70 actually shut down statewide for a little while. So that's some other interesting information. Again, Kansas City had a little bit less snow, but still getting into those double-digit totals in the Kansas City metro area. As you can see, the heaviest snow is across western and central Missouri. There was actually reports of around 18 to 20 inches of snow across the Nevada area. And then Joplin didn't have nearly as much at about 10 inches, but of course that's still enough to cause some problems. Columbia reported about 17 to 18 inches of snow on that particular storm. And you'll see that this storm went all the way from Oklahoma to the Great Lakes region as well. Even some snow, a little bit lighter across the Northeast as well. There were blizzard warnings that were in effect. The National Guard even had to come out and plow some of the county roads across southwestern Missouri. So certainly quite a notable winter storm that we had. That was also just less than 4 months before the Joplin tornado tore through Joplin, Missouri. That, of course, being an EF5 tornado that killed hundreds of people. So that was quite a destructive year in the weather department. Of course, this being the 15-year anniversary of a Groundhog Day blizzard. And so that's kind of a reminder that we can have here on this very Groundhog's Day. So what are we looking at this Groundhog's Day compared to 15 years ago? Well, you'll notice not a whole lot of action in comparison to where we were at this time 15 years ago. We do have a hard freeze warning still in effect across Georgia and Florida. We've actually had temperatures in the 20s and 30s across Florida. Very, very cold weekend across that region. We had some of the coldest temperatures since 2010 across some of the bigger cities there in Florida. So certainly one of the colder shots of air that we've seen there across the deep south, even picking up some snow, as we mentioned, across the Carolinas. Now, the interesting thing is, it seemed like the dead of winter across the eastern half of the country, but what about the western half of the country? We haven't really talked about this too much, and that's because there really hasn't been a whole lot to look at here. We just haven't had a whole lot of moisture, not a whole lot of snowfall up in the mountains here, and that means that our Sierra snowfall pack is a little bit on the below average here. This, of course, from the Forest Service, U.S. Department of Agriculture, showing us that snow depth across the country here. Of course, with a lot more of that snowpack settling in across the eastern half of the country. But again, out west, there just hasn't been a whole lot of snow to be seen so far. As far as where we're at compared to our average, we've only seen about 15 or 57% of our normal snowpack that we would normally have up until this point. Of course, April 1st kind of being that cutoff, or at least around that cutoff. So 36% of where we should be by the end of the season. The northern region, it has the lowest amount compared to average. And so you'll notice here's where we should be. We should be over here at this 15-inch mark over here around this time of year. 15 inches of water is where we should be at this time of year. And as of right now, we're below, or at about, it says about 9.7 is where we're at based on the latest observations. And you'll notice how we've just kind of flattened out here in the month of January. Just not a whole lot of snow at all, really. I mean, it's not even lower than average. We just haven't had any snowfall really during the entire month of January. So it's been very lacking across the Sierra snowpack. Of course, 30% of the snow water account, or 30% of California's fresh water is supplied by this snowpack. So this is a really big deal. This also affects whether or not we're going to go into a drought. This also affects fire season. Typically, when we have a smaller snowpack, or we have less of that snowpack, typically when that happens, we have a drier, we have more fires, we have all of that. So that's what our biggest concern is at this point in time, is that we could be looking at a more active fire season. The northern region is significantly below. Of course, this is the previous winter where we were a little bit below average as well, but we were a lot higher than where we are at this point in the season. The southern region is a little bit closer to average, but still definitely quite a bit below where we should be for this point in the season. So we certainly need the snow out west in order to avoid a bad fire season. So we'll have to see what happens moving forward. We'll talk more about that in the long range of whether or not we will see snow out west returning, as the pattern is expected to get more active out west in the weeks to come. We'll show you that here in a moment. Of course, we've still got the snowpack here across Missouri. We've also had the added snowpack across Georgia, the Carolinas, and also across the north. So this is certainly going to be really good for any drought concerns that we had across the state of Missouri. Not necessarily going to erase the drought that we have across Missouri, but it certainly is going to help out. The longer that that snow stays on the ground, the more moisture is able to be absorbed into the ground, and so that really helps us out. As far as our snowfall totals, I adjusted these a little bit once we got some of the final data from the last winter storm, but we ended up with about 5 inches here of accumulation in the Columbia area. So that puts us at about 8.6 inches for the year, which is still quite a bit below the seasonal average. But the majority of our snow falls in January and February here across Missouri. And so it's certainly possible that we can add to these totals here. Of course, we're still a ways off from my forecast that I made back in November. And we're only forecasting maybe a dusting in the next 7 days. Even that is looking like a bit of a stretch. Of course, we did get some snow and some ice from that winter storm over a week ago, and we still have some power outages across Mississippi and Tennessee. So hopefully we can get power back to those areas. I mean, 48,000 customers are still without power in the state of Mississippi, 26,000 in the state of Tennessee. California and Florida also have a significant amount of power outages as well. So hopefully some power will be restored across those regions. All right. Enough about Groundhog's Day, enough about what we've seen so far. What about what's to come? Let's kind of look a little bit closer at that. So this is from tropicaltidbits.com. Of course, that was also from poweroutage.com. So you can find the live updates on the power outages. If you go to poweroutage.com, this is at tropicaltidbits.com. And so this is from the 12Z GFS run on February 2nd. We're going to show you that precipitation, a little bit of snow across the Great Lakes, not a whole lot. This is pretty much nothing, just maybe some flurries across that area here. And then as we go into the middle of this week, we're watching a very, very weak storm system across the eastern portion of the U.S. that is going to drop our temperatures a little bit by the middle of this week here across Missouri. Not expecting a whole lot. A lot of this is going to stay as rain, so that's going to help to melt some of that snow here across the deep south and across the Carolinas as well. And so then we've got another system that we need to watch across the Northeast as well. That could bring us some snow. But overall, things looking pretty dry here across the overall picture across the country as far as that snowfall that's in the forecast. In the next 7 days, this is how much snowfall is forecast from the GFS model. So light accumulations across the northern plains, a little bit heavier across the Appalachians and into the Great Lakes and Northeast. That's where we could see some heavier snow, particularly this weekend. Not a whole lot of activity out west, but we are starting to see a little bit of activity in the higher elevations, but still not a whole lot overall. Will we get anything out of this next storm system that's going to drop our temperatures tonight? We could see a few flurries across Missouri, a few rain showers, a few sprinkles as we go into tomorrow. Probably a whole lot of nothing, though. A whole lot of nothing is probably what we're going to be looking at through today. So, not a whole lot of precipitation expected through the remainder of this week. Of course, across the Northeast, that's where we're going to be watching system number one by tomorrow night. A little bit of light snow, not a whole lot of travel disruptions out of that one. And then here's the bigger system as we go into this weekend. Still a little bit of uncertainty of what that's going to look like at this point in time. As far as our temperature outlook, we are going to be warming up significantly over the next couple of days. Again, a brief cool spell as we go into Tuesday and Wednesday with temperatures returning to about freezing for high temperatures for your Tuesday and Wednesday across Missouri. And then by Thursday and Friday, we're definitely going to see quite a warm up. And you'll notice that we will see much colder temperatures, or cooler than average temperatures remaining across the Great Lakes and Northeast. So not a whole lot of changes with that, but you'll notice that temperatures are going to be going into the well above average category as we go into this weekend and also into the early part and middle part of next week as well. So that goes into Wednesday and Thursday. So again, most likely staying well above average. And the same thing can be said if we look at NOAA's 6 to 10 day temperature outlook, staying most likely above average across the western and central part of the US. So 40s, 50s, maybe even some 60-degree days are ahead. And so any of that snowfall that is still on the ground right now, which looks like we do still have quite a bit of snow out there right now, it will be gone by the end of this week. I mean, there might be a few piles on the sides of the parking lots and roadways, but overall, a lot of that's going to be melted by the end of this week. Precipitation outlook staying near average. A little bit of precipitation out west is expected. We're expected to go a little bit above average, so hopefully that'll help us out with that Sierra snowpack that we were talking about earlier. The 8 to 14 day outlook staying above average. So above average temperatures expected for the next couple of weeks. Are we done with the worst of winter? Very well as possible based on looking at these next couple of weeks. Phil certainly could have been wrong when he said 6 more weeks of winter, because I can tell you that the next 2 weeks look like an early spring. The last two things we'll look at is the risk of hazardously cold temperatures. We've got that risk across the Northeast. So again, like I mentioned before, it's going to be staying pretty cold across the Northeast and the Great Lakes, at least over the next week or two, with even a high risk of below normal temperatures across the Northeast expected by the early part of next week. That's next Monday and Tuesday where we have that high risk. Again, all of these are from NOAA. And then we'll wrap things up with the wind outlook, not only staying below average on our temperatures across the Northeast, but also staying on the windy side as we go into next Monday and Tuesday. This indicating that we have the slight risk of high winds across the state of Missouri going into next week. So here's the overall story. Drier and warmer for this week, wetter and warmer and windier for the week following across the state of Missouri. Well, that wraps things up on our weather. Now we will move into our sports reports. All right, and now we're back with sports here. Of course, this is a really big week when it comes to sports, so we're going to talk about all of that and more. And then, of course, we'll have the weekly surprise once we are done looking at that. So, again, a lot to get to in today's sports report, and we also are very limited on time right now, so we're going to go through this pretty quickly. First, we're going to start off with last night's really big game, of course, the NHL Stadium Series game. Of course, this has been something that the NHL has been doing since 2014 in order to produce that stadium outdoor atmosphere for the National Hockey League. Usually this takes place in February or early March. Of course, this year's was last night on February 1st. So that was a really big event. We had the Boston Bruins versus the Tampa Bay Lightning, and it was quite a matchup with the Bruins starting off with the early lead 3-1 at the end of the first period. Then Tampa Bay made a comeback, made it 5-4 by the end of the second period, and then tied it in the third period, sending this game into overtime where we had Tampa Bay, the Lightning that won in the overtime 6-5 against the Boston Bruins. Of course, this was a really big game because Tampa Bay was able to maintain its lead in the Atlantic Division standings for this year here, staying at the number one spot. Detroit and Montreal are behind them. Detroit 32-18, Montreal 31-17. The Boston Bruins are just a little bit behind both of those teams, the number four spot in their division at 32-20. This would have given the Boston Bruins an opportunity to pull ahead if they were able to pull off the victory. But that being said, it was the home team, Tampa Bay, the Lightning, that were able to seal the deal in an electric finish 6-5 in that Stadium Series game. What a game it certainly was. What a comeback for them as well after being down 5-1 at one point in the game. So certainly quite a comeback story for them. So we also had the 2026 Australian Open that came to a conclusion as well. Congratulations to Christian Harris winning with Neil Skupskin from that was U.S. Christian Harrison, who was able to win in the men's doubles round. So, congratulations to him, as well as all of the other competitors across the world who competed within that competition. Speaking of worldwide competitions, this coming Friday, we've got the opening ceremony of the 2026 Winter Olympics that is going to be taking place. The Winter Games will be taking place from February 6th all the way through February 22nd. And to mark this special occasion, we are going to be having a special episode at 9 o'clock on Friday night here on the Great World Podcast. And we're going to be debating some controversial topics of the Winter Olympics and the Summer Olympics, just kind of overall. And so that's going to be a special episode this coming Friday. It's going to be just hours after that opening ceremony takes place there in Milan. So certainly, some exciting stuff. Also, for the first time since 2014, notably, the NHL players have been allowed to participate in the men's ice hockey tournament. So that's the first time that the NHL has made a return. Again, first time in 12 years that has taken place here in the Winter Games. So certainly a lot of excitement and a lot of anticipation for that. Of course, this being the first ever Winter Olympics that has been hosted by two different cities. So, and then something else that's going to be happening this week. Again, we've just got all sorts of exciting sports news coming your way. This coming Sunday is the Super Bowl. We've also got a second special episode here on the Great World Podcast coming up Saturday night at 9 p.m. Central Time. So another special episode. Again, we've got 3 new episodes coming your way this week on the Great World Podcast here And we'll have one over the 60th Super Bowl. We will be covering details surrounding the Super Bowl. We'll be having another debate series about the NFL, and then some other surprises are in store for that as well. So, of course, that is going to be the 60th Super Bowl coming on February 8th, this coming Sunday, at Levi Stadium, California, home of the 49ers. So, it will certainly be an exciting game there in Santa Clara. Of course, there's been a lot of predictions that have been made. As of right now, the Seattle Seahawks are favored in this game by about 65% chance of winning the game. That's when you look at the odds. As far as historical odds, if we look back at the playoff history of Seattle, this is the first time that Seattle has made the Super Bowl since they lost, ironically, against New England in the 49th Super Bowl. And so New England Patriots, they did end up winning that game. Of course, that was after the Seahawks won in overtime to go to the Super Bowl against the Packers. Of course, this year they had a much more dominant win across the 49ers, or excuse me, across that was the 49ers game, but then they won in the conference championship game 31-27. That was a much closer game that took place, but it didn't go into overtime like it did in the conference game back in Super Bowl 49. Seattle has not gone to the Super Bowl since they lost against the Patriots 11 Super Bowls ago. The Patriots have a much different story. They've actually been to the Super Bowl three times since their last appearance against Seattle. So just some interesting information there. Of course, they won in overtime against the Atlanta Falcons back in the 2016 playoff game. That was after coming off. That was after coming off a loss against the Broncos in the conference championship game in the 2015 playoffs. They also lost the Super Bowl against the Eagles back in 2018 during the 2017 series. And then their last victory in the Super Bowl, and the last time they played in the Super Bowl, the Patriots, was against the Los Angeles Rams, where they won 13-3. That game was back on February 3rd of 2019. So this will be the first time that that has happened, or the first time that they have competed since that loss back in 2019. So it's kind of interesting that the last time that both the Patriots and the Seahawks were in the Super Bowl, the last time that each of those teams played their Super Bowl, they lost. Obviously, that won't be the case for one team going into this week. Of course, the Patriots have won more Super Bowls than the Seahawks have. But will they win this time around? Because they're not favored. So we'll have to see what happens this coming Sunday night. That can be seen on NBC and Peacock. That will be starting at 6:30 Eastern Time, 5:30 Central, 3:30 on the West Coast, where it will be happening, as we mentioned. So should be quite the interesting battle. The East Coast Patriots facing off against the West Coast Seattle Seahawks on the West Coast on NBC this coming Sunday night. So you'll have to make sure to tune into that, as I know millions of Americans will be doing that, but also to stay tuned for that halftime show and some of those million-dollar commercials as well. And so before we wrap things up on the sports end of things, we mentioned the Survivor 50 challenge that's going on across the United States here. Interestingly enough, today on Groundhog's Day is actually the day that the Missouri competition is going to be taking place. It's going to be starting at 4 p.m. Central Time, and as far as the location, the location is not explicitly said, but the clue is, in my opinion, pretty obvious. It talks about a saintly city in a station. The union begins upon your arrival. Talks about a wheel. Seems pretty obvious where it's at, but if you haven't figured it out yet, I'll give you some time to figure that out. But that hunt is going to be taking place from 4 to 9 p.m. Today. So we'll have to see who gets a trip to Los Angeles. So that ought to be very interesting. All right, so that's it for sports. And then the last thing that we have is your weekly surprise. We're going to go very quick through this. We had two massive breakthroughs within the past week or so. Researchers uncovered a ecosystem hidden underneath the Antarctic ice that has been there for 34 million years. So that's quite interesting. A whole other ecosystem underneath the continent that we thought was totally frozen. Well, it is frozen, but underneath is something that used to be not so frozen. So, and then the final thing was a bizarre new dinosaur species was uncovered in Africa, expanding our knowledge of the prehistoric life era. All right, well, that wraps things up for tonight on the weekly news. We'll see you here next week.